In this unit, we're going to look at the failure of Reconstruction. And you're going to need to know why Reconstruction was a failure. So if you remember, Reconstruction is the time period after the Civil War in which they're trying to put the South back into the United States politically. It is not about rebuilding the South. Even though the South is destroyed, that's not what it means. It means it's about reconstructing the country politically. So we're going to look at this. We're going to look at the end of Reconstruction, and we're also going to look at why Reconstruction was a failure. And it's a failure for a lot of different reasons, like anti-African American groups like the Ku Klux Klan and competing national interest. We're also going to look at the removal of the federal troops from the South, which would help African Americans. And we're also going to look at Jim Crow laws, which are segregation laws, and voter restrictions that were placed on African Americans, which really make things go almost back to the way they were prior to the Civil War. African Americans really, they don't have any rights after 1877 when the Union Army leaves the South. So some reasons why Reconstruction was a failure and actually ended up ending. The Ku Klux Klan is intimidating African Americans as well as white Republicans who were thought to help African Americans. They were threatened by lynchings and beatings and violence, and so that really kept African Americans from exercising social and political rights. While the federal troops are in the South, they're able to protect African Americans to an extent. Think about it, the South is pretty big, though. They're not going to be able to protect all African Americans. They are going to be able to protect them somewhat. White Southern Democrats are also going to be trying to come back to power. And that's what redeem means. They're trying to come back to power in the South, redeem the South, and they want to return to public office. And as these white Southern Democrats are able to be elected again and they're gaining their political rights back, then they're going to get voted into office more and more, and as a result, Republicans are going to be voted out of office, and so that's going to lead to more and more white Southern Democrats coming back and turning things back to the way they were prior to the Civil War and not really protecting African Americans' rights. And that's what the term Solid South means, is that pretty much in the South, the Solid South is going to vote Democrat every single election. If you were a Republican in the South, from between 1877 and 1960 something, late 1968, somewhere around there, then really you're not going to have a lot of chance to be elected to office. And it's really going to change in 1968 with the election of Richard Nixon. And that's right during the middle of the Civil Rights era, when it's obvious that Democrats are supporting African Americans more while Republicans are not. There are also a lot of distractions in the North that are going to lead to the end of Reconstruction. Think about, they've been focused on this for, so many years. Think about back to the compromises that happened in Missouri, the Compromise of 1850, and then the actual start of the Civil War in 1861 until the end of Reconstruction in 1877. That's a long time. So they're really just kind of tired of fighting. They're tired of worried about what's happening in the South. There are also a lot of scandals and corruption in Ulysses S. Grant's administration. There's an economic depression happening in the North, which is going to cause them to be distracted because in the North they're going to be more concerned with the economy than with what's actually happening in the South. There's also a lot of violence against these freed African Americans in the South. And so a lot of people in the North are starting to question, why are we helping out in the South? It's not changing anything. There's so much violence going on, we'll never be able to fix it, is what they're saying. They're also interested in Western settlement, and so they want to take some of those resources that they're using and put it towards Western settlement, like military resources, economic resources. And then there's also continued resistance in the South to Reconstruction. The South, white Southerners in the South hate Reconstruction, and they're not going along willingly, and so the North's having to fight them the entire way. The election of 1876 is what's going to lead to the end of Reconstruction. There's no clear winner in the presidential election between the Democrat, Samuel Tilden, and the Republican, Rutherford B. Hayes. So if no one has a clear majority, then it goes to the House of Representatives. In the House of Representatives, they come up with a compromise, and that's the Compromise of 1877. What they do is they say Rutherford B. Hayes is going to become president, but as a result, they're going to move the Army out of the South. So there's two parts. Rutherford B. Hayes becomes president, and the Army leaves the South. Well, if the Army is not in the South to protect freed African Americans, then no one's going to protect these freed African Americans. Once the troops left, there's no one left to protect African Americans' rights in the South that were given to them by the 14th and 15th Amendments. The police certainly aren't protecting African Americans. No one really is trying to help them anymore. And so African Americans are slowly going to, or quickly going to lose their social rights as well as their political rights. Political rights are what we're going to talk about now. African Americans end up being denied the right to vote, which was given to them by the 15th Amendment. What happens is Southerners put in place literacy tests and poll taxes. Literacy tests would ask them certain questions they had to answer to be able to vote. They had to prove that they were smart enough to vote. A lot of times these were very unfair. Or they had to pay poll taxes. They'd have to pay a tax in order to vote. Well, a lot of African Americans didn't have enough money to pay that poll tax. While while white Southerners were still able to vote because what they passed was called the grandfather clause. Since their grandfather and fathers had voted, then they could vote. But since African Americans' grandfathers hadn't and fathers hadn't voted, they couldn't take advantage of that same loophole in the law. Jim Crow laws were also passed to segregate the races. This would be an example of the 14th Amendment being violated. These were segregation laws, which these segregation laws like different water fountains for the races, different schools for the races, having to sit in the back of the bus. And the Supreme Court's actually going to uphold segregation a little bit later with Plessy versus Ferguson. Very important Supreme Court case. The concept that comes out of Plessy versus Ferguson is the idea of separate but equal. So as long as the different facilities were equal, they could be separate. Now the problem with that is there's no such thing as separate but equal. If you have separate facilities, they are going to be unequal, and they are unequal, but no one does anything about that. No one cares that they are unequal. The white school and the black school won't have the same quality of education. A lot of times the white school would be really nice, while the African American school wouldn't. A lot of times, like, the textbooks would be handed down from the white school to the black school, and the actual building wouldn't be nearly as good, or wouldn't be as up to date. So there's no such thing as separate but equal, and that's actually going to be overturned by Brown versus Board of Education in the 1950s. But that's a long time until 1950. So if you think about 1877, Reconstruction comes to an end, and then Plessy versus Ferguson, and so I mean that's going to happen a little bit later. So really you have a long time before equality is going to happen, and we could even argue if it's even truly happened yet. African Americans are also kept impoverished by sharecropping and tenant farming, and they're only allowed to have menial jobs. They're not allowed to go to school to become like doctors or lawyers or anything like that. And so what's going to end up happening, and like we talked about in class, is that sharecropping is going to keep them economically impoverished. And it's going to get even worse because cotton's basically going to exhaust the soil. They've been farming on that soil for so long, the nutrients are kind of gone. And so cotton prices are going to fall. And that means sharecroppers and tenant farmers are going to find themselves increasingly in difficult conditions, increasingly in debt. Remember the whole process of sharecropping. Basically what's going to happen is that sharecroppers are going to harvest their crops, they're going to sell them, and then they're going to use all that money to try to pay off their debt, but they're not even going to pay off all their debt. So they're just going to be continuously in debt, in economic servitude. African Americans in the South are going to fall further and further into poverty and going to have a tough time getting out. Some African Americans are going to start leaving the South to try to find jobs in the North. Not really going to happen yet. Most of this is going to happen later when we start talking about the Great Migration in the early 1900s. So that really concludes this unit on why Reconstruction was a failure. It's really simple. Reconstruction is a failure because it doesn't actually change very much in the South. African Americans are still indebted. They're still socially, still being their rights are being violated socially, politically, economically, and not much really changes. So that concludes the unit. Please go to Canvas, turn in the notes guide, and take the video quiz. Thank you.